Hello and welcome to World Talks on TVP World with me, Aisha Bajam. Russian President Vladimir Putin made his first ever visit to the disputed Kuril Islands on the Pacific Ocean, immediately drawing an angry protest from Japan. The islands have been controlled by Moscow since the end of World War II, but Tokyo claims the four southernmost islands as its own, making it a source of contention ever since. So why did Putin decide to go there now? And joining us is Peter Dickinson, editor of UkraineAlert at the Atlantic Council. Hello, sir. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's great to join you. Good evening.
Good evening. So, Mr. Dickinson, let's start with the obvious. Why did Vladimir Putin choose to visit the disputed Kuril Islands now, and what message do you think he wants to send Japan?
Well, this was a classic piece of Russian political theatre, and I think there were a number of messages. I think in terms of Japan, the message was certainly, if you continue to support Ukraine and align yourself with the West against Russia, there will be costs. That will have costs to you in terms of your relationship with Russia. Any talk of a possible compromise or settlement regarding these disputed islands will be off the table. On the contrary, Russia will consolidate its grip there and will rule out any form of concessions, but also maybe will increase the militarization there and increase pressure on Japan. So it was a kind of warning shot to the Japanese, suggesting that, if you continue to back Ukraine, Japan has not been a major supporter of Ukraine, certainly not in a military sense, but they have provided a lot of financial support, a lot of diplomatic support. And so I think Russia wants to send a signal there to the Japanese that may come with costs. But there were other messages as well, I would suggest here. I think, Putin also wanted to send a message to his bosses in Beijing. China and Japan have recently seen a lot of tension in their relationship. So Putin will have wanted to remind the Chinese that Russia is a useful ally, not only in terms of what it can bring in relations with America or with Europe, but also in the Far East, and that Russia is still a significant geopolitical player. And also from Putin's point of view, this gives him an opportunity to flex his muscles a bit on the international stage, to remind people that despite all of the problems that Russia has faced, all the very, very well-publicized problems that Russia has faced and is facing in Ukraine, Russia remains a major military power which has interests globally and will look to defend those interests. Also, he got a chance to remind people that he actually has a fleet, because, of course, the Black Sea Fleet has been decimated by Ukraine. It's virtually inactive now. The Baltic Fleet is really struggling to make its presence felt. Putin recently celebrated the Russian Naval Day on land in front of a picture of a submarine in St. Petersburg, which kind of underlined how modest the current status of the Russian Navy is. So this was an opportunity for him to get on some warships and to say, look, we are still a global power and we still have a navy.
But Putin did say that the Asia-Pacific region was, and this is a quote from him, unfortunately becoming increasingly prone to conflict. And you have just mentioned that he is flexing his muscles, but if it were to come down to an actual conflict, would Russia be able to finance a conflict on the Asia-Pacific region?
Absolutely, yes. I mean, Russia is still a global power. They wouldn't be a leading force in any conflict in the Asia-Pacific region. They would be supporting the Chinese. I mean, any conflict that takes place there will be surely led by Beijing. I think that's clear to everyone. It would be primarily between China and America's allies in the region. But I think Russia wants to say, look, guys, we're still here. Don't forget about us, as it were. We're still part of this bigger picture. And again, despite the setbacks Russia has suffered in Ukraine and the very heavy losses they have suffered, they do still have a very significant Pacific fleet. They have a submarine fleet. They have a strong air force. They have a lot of technological capabilities. So, they may not have the massive manpower that people we've historically associated with Russia available, because those resources are being used in Ukraine and being lost in Ukraine. But they still have very considerable resources, and they remain one of the major military forces in the Pacific region.
And Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi actually called Putin's visit unacceptable. Tokyo has formally protested. What can Japan realistically do? I mean, do they have a leverage? And could this episode lead to a larger Japanese military buildup or even closer security cooperation with the United States in the region?
Well, I think we can rule out any sort of direct military response. They're not going to get involved in some sort of a very, very direct confrontation with the Russians. But yes, certainly they will regard this as a threat, as a threatening move, as a signal of Russian intent. So they will look to strengthen their defenses. They will look to strengthen their alliances. It will probably give new impetus to defense spending and defense policy domestically in Japan. And perhaps also they might look at this and say, okay, how can we push back against Russia here? Well, the best way to push back against Russia, of course, is to support Ukraine. Now, Japan has certain constitutional constraints in terms of what it can do in support of Ukraine. That might be something they'd want to look at now and perhaps reassess, or perhaps they might want to find some workarounds that would allow them to more directly support Ukraine. But I think if they're looking to push back against the Russians and say, okay, we're not going to allow you just to make these bold gestures and not pay a price, then I think the obvious place where the price would be paid would be on the battlefield of Ukraine.
So, Mr. Dickinson, can we just roll back here and talk about a little bit about the territorial dispute? Where does it actually stand today, legally, politically? These four little islands are disputed, and they have actually they've been limiting Russia and Japan from actually having a formal peace treaty after the World War II. So, where do they stand right now?
Well, the islands were seized by the Russians at the end of World War II, but they were actually, the actual agreement to hand them over to Russia came in Yalta when the three great allied powers, the Soviet Union, the United States of America, and Great Britain came together. Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin came together in Yalta, here in Ukraine, in 1945, in January, February of 1945, and they essentially carved up the post-war world. And one of the minor details of that carve-up was handing those islands over to the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union then took possession of them in the very final days of the war, at a time when Japan was, of course, in no position to resist, to try and prevent the Russian takeover. And ever since, it's been a point of contention. The Japanese refused to accept the loss of these islands. There have been negotiations. There have been attempts to sort of broker some sort of a deal there, perhaps over partial return of the islands to Japan, but it's not gone anywhere. We're still at a situation where there's no breakthrough, but there has been talk of some sort of a concession from the Russian side at numerous times historically, and that's something that Putin has continued to sort of dangle over the Japanese, sort of as bait to say, guys, let's have good relations, because if we do, who knows, maybe we'll be able to somehow settle this issue. But I think the Russian narrative, the Russian rhetoric has hardened a lot in recent years on the issue, and I think today's visit really sends a clear message that any talk of compromise is now out of the question. The Russians are being very clear. This is their land, and they're not going to negotiate on that anymore.
Indeed, especially after Japan joined Western powers in sanctioning Russia. And these small remote islands, I mean, they're in a very important part of the Pacific Ocean, right? Close to Japan, and approaches Russia's far east. But what makes their location so strategically valuable to Moscow? I mean, they are excellent for fishing and for rare minerals, but what more?
I think their leverage over the Japanese. I don't think they are particularly important for Russia in terms of any other strategic advantages they may bring. I mean, Russia has immeasurable natural wealth. Russia has incredible amounts of territory. It's approximately 1/6 of the world. Russia, by all rights, should be by far the richest country on the entire planet. And in terms of natural resources, it is the richest country on the entire planet. So these islands are not, we can't talk about them as being strategically very valuable to the Russians. They are valuable, I think, purely in the sense that they provide some sort of leverage over the Japanese. And that's exactly how the Russians have used them historically. And as we see today, how they continue to use them.
So you've actually mentioned the Russians using them as a leverage also to please their big brother Beijing, so China. Can you explain us a little bit more about this dynamic right there?
Well, the Chinese-Japanese relationship obviously has historically been very challenging, but we've recently seen some tensions there with talk from Japan about what could potentially happen if China does make a move against Taiwan, for example. And there's been a kind of exchanges of quite hostile rhetoric there. The Chinese also suggesting that they won't allow the Japanese to have any say in their behavior with what they consider to be a domestic issue, a domestic Chinese issue. So I think really Russia's just sending a message here to, as I say, their bosses in Beijing, sending a message saying, look, guys, we can help you with this as well. We are actually useful here. We're also players in this environment, in this geopolitical theatre, and we can support you here. We can increase the pressure there. Also, as North Korea has done recently, we've seen a rocket launch recently from North Korea that was, considered to be very provocative by the Japanese. Another gesture that sends a message from a vassal of the Chinese saying, look, guys, China is not alone here. China is already, the dominant player in that region, but they also have allies who can increase the pressure on Japan from different sides. So to really isolate the Japanese and make them feel very insecure, I would say.
So Putin has made his first visit to the Kuril Islands. Can we expect him to go there more often now and to keep on poking or using this leverage, as it were?
I doubt he'd make it a regular event. I mean, he's managed to spend a quarter of a century in power without going there before, and he's done so now. I think he's made his point. But I think that he may well make other trips of a similar nature to remind people again that Russia remains a global power. Putin now is very, very cautious of what he does in European Russia because he's afraid of Ukrainian drones. He famously had to curtail his pride and joy, his military parade on Victory Day in May on Red Square in Moscow because he was afraid of the drones. He was unable to hold his annual Navy Day parade in St. Petersburg this year. His economic forum in St. Petersburg in June was also under a literal cloud of Ukrainian drone strikes on nearby oil refineries and a naval base. So he's limited on where he can show his face inside Russia itself. And he's also not able to travel a lot internationally because there's an international arrest warrant for war crimes from the International Criminal Court over his involvement in the mass abduction and indoctrination of Ukrainian children. So he's limited on where he can travel internationally as well. So I think he'll be looking. The Asia Pacific region now is an attractive region because Russia, it's Russian territory. Putin can feel relatively safe there, and it's out of range of Ukrainian drones. So I'm not sure he'll be going to these particular islands on a regular basis, but I certainly wouldn't be surprised to see him spending more time in Siberia and the Russian Far East.
Indeed, to still make a point of Russia being a world power in Putin's world. Thank you so much, Peter Dickinson, editor of UkraineAlert at the Atlantic Council, for joining us on this edition of World Talks.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us, but do stay tuned to TVP World for more news and analysis. I'm Aisha Badja. See you next time.